Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at the George Washington University. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Conservative Dilemma, Digital Surrogate Organizations in the Future of Liberal Democracy. This workshop has been organized jointly by GW's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics and by the Social Science Research Council in New York. It's also an outcome of two important initiatives led by GW professor in IDDP, founding director Stephen Livingston. In 2019, Professor Livingston conceptualized and led GW's effort to convince the Knight Foundation to support the creation of a new institute dedicated to the study of disinformation and its effects. From a pool of over 100 proposals, the Knight Foundation invested $5 million in the creation of IDDP. The second initiative was an SSRC workshop on the institutional origins of disinformation, an initiative Professor Livingston co-led with Lance Bennett from the University of Washington. The resulting edited volume, The Disinformation Age, was published in the SSRC Anxieties of Democracy series with Cambridge University Press. Our virtual gathering today is the culmination of GW and SSRC's collaborations into our joint commitment to creating knowledge that hopes to understand the threats to liberal democracy and finding ways to address them. This workshop is organized around a core consideration of the impact of online extremism on political institutions, particularly center-right or conservative political parties. The very efforts such parties must undertake to remain viable in a democracy leave them susceptible to drifting into illiberalism. The model we rely on in our discussion was formulated by Harvard political historian Daniel Ziblatt. We're very pleased that Professor Ziblatt will open the workshop today with a keynote address. Tomorrow, a second keynote will be delivered by Professor Kate Starbird, co-founder of the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, one of IDDP's partners in the Knight Foundation Consortium. She will pick up on the role of social media platforms in possibly exacerbating the challenges created by the conservative dilemma. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Dean Walbeck, and thank you and welcome to our audience. My name is Mike Miller. I am a program director at the Social Science Research Council, or SSRC. And I'm delighted to join our friends at George Washington University and the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics to bring you this two-day event, which, alas, could not be more timely or critical. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, the SSRC is an independent, international, nonprofit organization founded in 1923 and located in New York City. For nearly 100 years, SSRC has fostered innovative research, nurtured new generations of social scientists, and mobilized knowledge to inform important public issues. Today, there are few public issues more salient than the relationship between media, technology, and politics. And the Council is home to a suite of programs that, in a variety of ways, seek to shed light on these phenomena. These include MediaWell, a dynamic digital platform and public resource that curates and distills urgent research on mis- and disinformation, the Social Data Initiative, which seeks to improve pathways for researchers to access the data necessary to understand the impact of social media on society. Just Tech, a new council program, which seeks to improve pathways for researchers to access the data a new council program that informs our understanding of technological change by foregrounding questions of inequity, social justice, and public impact, and our Media and Democracy program, which through research workshops and public events such as today's, fosters new knowledge about the ever-evolving relationship between media technology and politics. In each of these efforts, the Council's work acknowledges that just as media and media infrastructure can be deployed in service of democratization, accountability, and public empowerment, so too can they be used to promote authoritarianism, surveillance, and disinformation. We invite you to learn more about our work at ssrc.org. We are grateful to the Knight Foundation for supporting today's events as well as to our partners at the IDDP for their tireless work, and to our keynote speakers and panelists for lending their time and expertise. And with that, I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Stephen Livingston. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to this workshop in democracy and political extremism. I am Stephen Livingston, GW professor and founding director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. As Dean Walbeck noted, IDDP exists thanks to a generous investment by the Knight Foundation. I want to begin by thanking my colleagues at the Social Science Research Council. Jason Rohde, Michael Miller, and Cole Edick are consummate professionals who give careful attention to every detail and are always one step ahead in planning. It's been a joy to have this opportunity to work with them. I also want to thank my Institute colleagues, Elise Meyer and Margot Cunniffe. As always, they've been extraordinary. And of course, I want to thank Dean Walbeck for the support of the college, and also GW's Provost Office for its support. One might be struck by the generous use of social science terminology in describing the themes of the workshop. Theory building requires precise language. But let's put aside the technical terms for a moment and describe in plain language what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand the effects of far-right extremism on liberal democratic institutions. One kind of political institution stands out: center-right or conservative political parties. The emergence of illiberalism or authoritarianism seems to have something to do with the situation that center-right parties find themselves in during times of extreme social and economic inequality. How can these parties appeal to a broad, non-elite public in order to be competitive in elections without alienating their core constituency, an economic elite? As Professor Daniel Ziblatt notes, it's a dilemma. Center-right parties often try to resolve it by campaigning on issues that appeal to potential supporters from across class divides. They are, in this sense, relying on cross-cutting issues. Additionally, party allies or surrogates, such as cultural institutions, media organizations, and single-issue advocacy groups, help center-right parties draw attention to these cross-cutting issues. When it works, center-right parties come to terms, though perhaps sometimes reluctantly, with liberal democratic norms and practices. Yet there's a danger in this strategy. The most effective cross-cutting issues often involve status anxieties and grievances. This can come to include hate speech if it doesn't start out that way. Party surrogates and cross-cutting issues they push can consume a conservative party and pull it into an embrace of authoritarianism. Now add online extremist groups that scale and amplify hateful messages. This takes us to our core question. Can liberal democracy survive in a period of great inequality and status anxieties that are ramped up by surrogates, including online extremists? If they can survive, how? What is needed? Professor Kate Starbird of the University of Washington will open our session tomorrow with her keynote address on digital extremism. Today, we begin with a keynote address by Daniel Ziblatt. Daniel Ziblatt is Eaton Professor of Government at Harvard University. He is also the director of the Transformations of Democracy Group at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, das Wissenschaftszentrum. He specializes in the study of Europe and the history of democracy. His many publications include How Democracies Die, written with Steve Levitsky. The book has been translated into 22 languages and was on the New York Times bestseller list, as well as on Der Spiegel's bestseller list in Germany. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. This is one of the books that inspires this workshop and, of course, its title. We are delighted to have Professor Ziblatt with us today. I now turn the floor, or the Zoom link in this case, over to Professor Ziblatt. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve, for the kind introduction. And I'm really happy to be able to join all of you today. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I look forward to the conversation. And I really look forward to engaging in these really pressing topics with all of you. So as Steve notes in his introduction, a key question or key issue that motivates many of us are these questions: what has given rise to the explosion of illiberal right-wing radicalism in established democracies? What, in a sense, has gone wrong? Now, most of our attention in social science has focused on what you might think of as kind of bottom-up sources of this phenomena. How economic dislocation generates voter antagonisms, how immigration has come to be perceived as a cultural threat to some voters, how technology has changed how voters see the world. All of these accounts presume that what has happened is a kind of sharp break from the past, a sharp break from normal politics. What I want to do today is offer you a different angle on these questions. Because what I think we are witnessing is not some sharp break from the past, but instead the return of an old reoccurring dilemma, what I term the conservative dilemma, exactly as Steve has described it, that racked democracies in their foundational years in the early 20th century, but was mostly eclipsed from view for about 50 years after World War II. This dilemma, though, has returned in the 21st century with a vengeance. And what has made the return of the conservative dilemma so potent is that it is happening in a context in which you are all expert, an increasingly digitalized civil society landscape that has, in a very specific sense, democratized key political and social institutions. This development, though, paradoxically, I think has made our democracies more, not less vulnerable to the rise of demagogues and illiberal political forces. So what we're experiencing has echoes of the past, but with a particular twist. It's happening in the context of these newer technological developments. Okay, so let's start at the top. What is the conservative dilemma? The conservative dilemma is at the heart of democracy. The dilemma is that traditional center-right parties in Europe and North America have historically, and even today, disproportionately been the electoral home of upper-income voters, as over 50 years of cross-national voting data shows. But under full suffrage or full democracy, where the median voter is relatively poorer, conservative parties must figure out how to win over voters with much lower levels of income and sharply divergent economic interests. If conservatives' core constituency is upper-class voters, again, as voting data from the past century makes clear, winning over middle-class and especially lower-income voters is going to be a challenge. So given this, conservatives, even going back before World War II, and that was the subject of the book that I wrote that Steve mentioned, conservatives found they had to offer something else to voters. They had to highlight other non-economic appeals, identity appeals. In modern society, such identity appeals coming from conservatives, whether in Britain or Germany or the United States, typically stoked racial, ethnic, religious divisions. This is the appeal of nationalism. This is opposition to immigration. This is the call to defend the nation from decline. These non-economic issues, many racially tinged, all involving strong identities and strong emotions, are extremely useful to conservatives in democratic electoral competition. Now, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the period that I focused on in my work 100 years ago, the conservative dilemma wrought havoc on democracies. Traditional conservatives, by playing with these identity issues, in some cases paved the way ultimately for the rise of extremist and even fascist movements. But what's striking is that from about 1945 until the 1990s, the conservative dilemma, while never fully disappearing from view in Western Europe and North America, was largely submerged. Think for a moment of the West German Christian Democratic Party, for instance. This is a party that in the 1950s had some traditional religious appeals, cast itself as a defender of traditional ways of life. But by the 1960s, the party was mostly conceived of itself and sold itself as a defender of a particular variant of market capitalism and democracy. Think of the British Conservative Party. They themselves ran as defenders in the post-war period of what they called property-owning democracy, a useful concept that stitched together the middle class and the wealthy in a broad economic coalition. It was easier for conservatives to appeal to middle-class voters on economic grounds alone when the gap between the richest and middle-income voters in a society was lower. So the conservative dilemma was, again, largely eclipsed, as long as economic inequality was lower, as it was in the post-war years. Now today, however, and over the past 30 years, as income inequality has again begun to skyrocket, as it did before World War II, the conservative dilemma has also returned. We've returned to a pre-1933 world. conservatives once again find it necessary to run on identity issues. And if you want to know what I mean more concretely, just think about the last 2 months of American politics and how the Republican Party has responded to President Joe Biden's massive COVID relief bills, infrastructure bills, proposals to tax big corporations and to raise taxes on the highest income earners in society. These are all massive and popular, for the most part, economic measures. Now, Republicans have responded to this not by making counter arguments on these economic policy proposals, but instead have tried to change the topic of conversation entirely by talking about cancel culture, Black Lives Matter, immigration, and Dr. Seuss. So the revival of the conservative dilemma and the rise of identity issues may be an inevitable part of democracy under conditions of high economic inequality. But even if it's inevitable, what is not inevitable is a more pernicious development when political parties and mainstream politicians lose control of these identity issues. One of the key lessons of my own research on pre-World War II conservatives is exactly that. When mainstream political parties lose control of the issues to outside surrogate groups, interest groups, advocacy groups, radical right civil society groups, the tail begins to wag the dog. This is exactly what happened to conservatives in Weimar Germany before the rise of Nazism. In Weimar Germany, it was nationalist and radical right civil society groups, veterans associations, anti-Semitic groupings, various nationalist pressure groups that pushed the German Conservative Party further and further to the right, ultimately displacing it. The result, of course, was calamitous. My fear is that something similar is happening today, especially in the United States. The rise of surrogate radical right groups is pushing mainstream parties to the right and threatens to replace them outright. But now it's not veterans associations per se mobilizing in the streets, although there is some of that too. It's often surrogate digital organizations that both are being used by politicians to mobilize voters while also simultaneously pushing politicians further and further to extreme positions. So the question is, why is all of this happening? In the last 10 or so minutes of my talk, I want to propose an answer to this question. Why is this happening? What has happened is not just the rise of new technologies, it's not just the rise of economic inequality, as important as those developments are. The rise of new technologies in particular are part of a broader set of developments. And those broader sets of developments essentially boil down to this. Political establishments are weakening across the globe. They're becoming more porous. Now, what do I mean by political establishment? Well, here's a shorthand definition. The political establishment is that network of organizations and actors that control the resources politicians need to get elected and to sustain a career. So for the sake of simplicity, I can focus on three types of establishment organizations. One is political parties, which are important to politicians because they control access to candidacies. Another is business, labor, and other interest groups, which are a critical source of finance and other campaign resources. And the third, and this is perhaps most relevant to us today, is major media outlets, such as television stations and newspapers, which are the principal means through which politicians gain access to voters. Now, political parties, interest groups, and media outlets, I want to make clear, do not constitute a single monolithic block. There's considerable amount of pluralism and competition among them. But they have historically imposed certain boundaries, both in terms of political style and policy substance. Politicians who exceed those boundaries, who violate certain behavioral norms or push extremist policies, tend to be shunned by the establishment. Party leaders won't nominate them. Union leaders won't back them. Mainstream media won't cover them, or at least will be biased against them. Now, half a century ago, this all mattered a great deal because political establishments maintained something that looked close to like a monopoly over the resources that politicians needed to get elected. Back in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s, it was hard to be an outsider and to gain power. Party leaders controlled the candidate selection process. There were no primaries, for example, in most democracies for selecting candidates or party leaders. This is the era of the infamous smoke-filled back rooms where candidates were selected. Number two, a relatively small number of interest groups provided the bulk of finance and other campaign resources, whether business or labor unions. And third, a limited number of media outlets dominated the media scene. The United States had 3 television networks. Germany had 2. Britain had 1. This meant that any politician who was serious about getting elected had to be on good terms with the establishment. Now, this dependence had important consequences. It meant that politicians couldn't just respond to voters and their preferences. They also had to respond to the establishment. They had to strike a balance between appealing to voters and appealing to the establishment. This had a broadly constraining effect. It meant that mostly the outsiders couldn't break in, and mostly only insiders or establishment candidates, pro-establishment candidates, could sustain successful political careers. Now, to be clear, in some senses, this arrangement was not entirely democratic, but it was pretty stable. And this was 20th century Western democracy, a system in which political competition was genuine and real, but nevertheless constrained by politicians' dependence on the establishment. Outsider politicians who challenged the establishment usually failed. Now, over the last few decades, establishments across the world have been losing their monopoly over electoral resources, which means they are losing their power over politicians. In many democracies, established parties have lost their monopoly over candidacies thanks to internal party democratization, so the introduction of primaries. In the United States, this began in 1972, which empowered voters, undermining the gatekeeping power of party leaders. Something has begun to happen, of course, across much of Europe as well, Britain, even to some extent in Germany as well. In addition to parties, second interest groups have lost their monopoly over campaign finance because candidates can raise money on the internet. I often like to think of this fact that Bernie Sanders, the consummate outsider, Bernie Sanders raised as much money as Hillary Clinton did, the consummate insider in the 2016 presidential campaign. Interest groups have declining power in Europe as well. And this all points then, though, to a third big change, the emergence of social media, which has eroded the influence of established media. So today, Twitter, Facebook, and other social media allow groups to organize outside of mainstream channels and allow candidates to reach voters even if they are shunned by the mainstream media. So my co-author, my book that Steve mentioned, How Democracies Die, my co-author Steve Levitsky visited Brazil at the beginning of that country's 2018 presidential election campaign. And while he was there, he met with a bunch of business leaders, most of whom backed the established center-right candidate. So even though this candidate was down in the polls when he visited, the business leaders he was meeting with were really convinced that he would eventually win because he was backed by a broad coalition of mainstream parties, which following Brazil's election laws gave him a huge advantage in allocated TV time. So he had more than an hour a night of free television time, whereas the right-wing candidate Bolsonaro had less than a minute of airtime every night. Now, nobody that Levitsky talked to in Sao Paulo mentioned WhatsApp or YouTube. But Bolsonaro used WhatsApp and YouTube and all of the groups organized there to bypass the television networks, and he won the election. In Germany today, the radical right Alternative for Germany doesn't necessarily need mainstream media institutions. When I was there last year doing some interviews with different journalists and so on, one journalist that I talked to writes for a major German magazine, told me that the AfD politicians don't do interviews with them anymore. She told me they don't need us. The AfD has its own YouTube channel that can use to communicate directly with voters. They also dominate social media. In the 6 months before the 2019 European parliamentary election, a study by Trevor Davis at GW analyzed 220 million Facebook interactions and found 86% of all Facebook shares of German political pages and 75% of comments at political news were connected to the AfD. So the radical right totally dominates social media, at least in the 2019 elections. The establishment parties were basically totally absent. So the outsider party, the AfD, is reaching to voters outside of traditional media channels. So, and somewhat all of this means is that politicians today don't need the establishment as much as they used to. They can raise money online and they can reach voters via Twitter and Facebook. And they can hijack political parties through primaries, like Donald Trump did in the United States, or in multi-party systems, they can create their own parties, like the Five Star Movement in Italy or the AfD in Germany. So for politicians, especially outsider politicians, this is actually quite liberating. It's much easier to bypass the establishment and even oppose the establishment than it was 50 years ago. Now this new scenario, is in certain ways more democratic than the old one. But it also means that it's easier for outsider surrogate groups, often digital, to drive the agenda of our politics. This also leaves us more vulnerable to demagogues, many of whom go on, once in office, to assault democratic institutions. So this is a real paradox. It's quite a paradox. As our civil society institutions have in a certain sense become more democratic, our democracy itself has become more vulnerable. When we combine this institutional porousness with the return of the conservative dilemma, we find ourselves in dangerous terrain. So I want to then conclude just with a couple of final thoughts here. We sometimes think that more democracy means fewer rules. I think this might not be the case. More democracy may require more rules. And what I mean by this is that, like today, in the early 20th century, was also marked by the rise of new technologies, radio before World War II, television after World War II. These technologies, like today, in a sense democratized civil society, but also opened the door to demagogues. Think of the right-wing radio personality, Father Coughlin, who dominated America's airwaves in the late 1930s, or of the Nazi Party's use of technology to consolidate power, to come to power and to consolidate power. The response to this in the United States was the invention of new regulatory structures like the Federal Communications Commission created in the 1930s to combat some of these developments, and the emergence of the Fairness Doctrine of 1949 to guarantee balance in the airwaves. We need equivalent regulatory structures for our own age. Democracy is certainly about making political institutions and social institutions more inclusive. It's also about making our institutions arenas of fair and freer competition. But to make such institutions endure, we need to recognize that democracy contains vulnerabilities. One of these is demagogues who can use the very institutions of democracy to attack them. With new threats, we need to develop new rules, new regulations to protect ourselves and our institutions. Back in the 1880s, the Atlantic magazine's editor, James Russell Lowell, was looking back to the Civil War in the 1860s. He regarded this as having triggered a breakdown of faith in American democracy. He wrote, thinking about the Civil War, he said, giving an appraisal of American history to this point, in a quote from Russell Lowell, he says, "After our Constitution got fairly into working order, it really seemed as if we had invented a machine that would go of itself. And this begot a faith in our luck, which even the Civil War itself but momentarily disturbed. So a machine that would go of itself." Lowell knew this was dangerous. It was dangerous to regard democracy as a machine that would go of itself. Democracy is not some kind of perpetual motion machine. It requires mending, new rules, new regulations to make it endure. This seems to me to be the central agenda facing all of us as we think about the new threats facing democracy today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ziblatt, for kicking off this event with such a provocative talk. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion, A Deepening Crisis, the Role of Digital Surrogate Organizations in Conservative Parties. Ulrike Klinger is a professor of political theory and digital democracy at the European New School of Digital Studies at European University Viadrina in Frankfurt, Germany. She's an associated researcher at the Weizenbaum Institute for the Network Society in Berlin, Germany, and an expert on media pluralism and defective democracies. She's worked extensively on the transformation of digital public spheres, the role of digital media in election campaigns, and the impact of technologies on public communication. Professor Klinger, welcome and thank you.
Welcome from Berlin, and thank you very much, Michael, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm really honored and happy to be part of this event and be the moderator for the discussion that is going to follow now, Professor Ziblatt's keynote. How are we going to do this? I will briefly introduce the panelists, then all three of them will have about 10 minutes for their statements to engage with what we've just heard. Afterwards, we're going to play it back to Professor Ziblatt, and perhaps he wants to answer some of the, or comment some of the remarks we've heard. And then pretty quickly, I will open up the discussion for you, for your comments, for your questions. So whenever you have questions or comments, please write them into the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat and take your questions from there. We don't have unlimited time, of course, but I hope that we can, pick up quite a few from your questions. So I will very briefly introduce the three panelists, only very briefly, because first of all, everyone here knows how to Google, and secondly, because their list of accomplishments is so long, and I don't want to take much time away from our discussion. So first on the panel, we have Dean Frielen. He is an associate professor at the Hussman School of Journalism and Media at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he's also a principal researcher at the Interdisciplinary Center for Information Technology and Public Life, CTAP, at this very place, a very cool place with lots of very interesting publications on social media and what's going on there. He's not only a scholar who's doing research on political uses of social media, but he's also fluent in programming languages and has contributed software applications for researchers to study what's going on social media. We also have Camille Francois with us. She is working at a company called Graphika that is doing social network analysis, and she's a chief innovation officer there. So she and her team are detecting and mitigating disinformation, media manipulation, and harassment. Before working at Graphika, she was a principal researcher at Google. She's not only a researcher, she's also an advisor to lots of governments and parliamentary committees across or on both sides of the Atlantic. She's associated with the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and she was distinguished by Time magazine as one of the 100 next most influential people in the world. So we were particularly happy that she found the time and can be with us here today. Third, we have Kurt Knüpfer with us. He actually was a postdoc researcher at George Washington University, but then came back to Berlin to join the Weizenbaum Institute for the Network Society, which is where Kurt and I met because we were both doing research there. And then he became a professor for political science with a focus on North America at the Freie Universität Berlin. So he studies US media as well as right-wing media, mostly right-wing media, the right-wing media ecosystem in Germany and in Europe. So welcome Dean, Camille, and Kurt. You have each now 10 minutes for your remarks to the keynote before we open the discussion. And please, everyone in the audience, please use the opportunity and leave your comments and questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat yeah, bring your question to the panel. So welcome, Dean. You're the first one to start.
Okay, I will start. I want to say that I had to prepare these remarks in advance, and so some of what I'm going to say has already been addressed in the full talk. So let me just go ahead and get started. I have some rather critical remarks. I hope they'll be taken in the critical sense intended here in the spirit of free debate, of course. So from my perspective, it seems as though if we're thinking about this in terms of a dilemma, it seems to me that the GOP has definitively chosen its particular horn here, the elite-driven one, right? And so on some level, it seems as though they've basically thrown their constituents under the bus. But then it seems as though maybe the constituents actually like it under that bus a little bit, right? And what I mean by that is that conservatives and Republicans are and have been for the past 4 to 5 years, 4 to 5 years, have been disproportionately tolerant of disinformation in terms of believing it and spreading it more, acting on it more. And they also attack elites who stray from those positions, like they did when they booed Mitt Romney at this weekend's Utah Republican convention. Now, it's a little bit outside of my research purview to speak specifically to the role of traditional organizations in this process. I don't know, for example, how much attention the typical Republican voter pays to what, say, the NRA or the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers have to say. But from where I'm sitting, the process looks very much elite-driven and very much in lockstep. Some of these elites are traditional, talking about folks like Rush Limbaugh, RIP, Laura Ingraham, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Wayne Dupree, etc. All these individuals dwell in various echelons of what Benkler and his colleagues refer to as the right-wing media ecosystem, where Fox News still dominates among all cable outlets of traffic and political content, but certainly the top of the right-wing media ecosystem. Recently, Fox News has been getting some competition from Newsmax and OAN. And of course, there are plenty of online-only outlets that exist in the further reaches of the ecosystem, including a little bit further, including Breitbart and Gateway Pundit, certainly compared to the audiences of Fox News. These are the mouthpieces not of America's contemporary center-right, to whatever extent it still exists, but what prior eras would have likely regarded as its far fringes. And so with the utmost respect, I wonder about how appropriate it is to consider the GOP a center-right party today. I'm not sure how controversial this is, in part because I'm not sure how controversial anything is these days. But I do not regard today's GOP as a center-right party, certainly not by domestic historical standards. Now, I'm happy to listen to arguments to the contrary, but both the scholarship with which I'm most familiar and the last few hundred news cycles all tell me that the GOP is a far-right party currently, and that the establishment has moved pretty far to the right. And indeed, what we've seen in recent years is a hollowing out of the party's center-right faction, of which, Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney are probably the most prominent exponents. We're talking about a party in which somewhere between 50 to 70% of members believe, despite a complete absence of evidence, that the most recent presidential election was fraudulent, all because their leader repeatedly asserted and still asserts that it is true, and because they desperately wish it to be so. And I'm really wondering, another aspect of this is that I'm really wondering about how much economic inequality really matters to the median GOP voter. It certainly seems to matter, and Professor Ziblatt mentioned this, it certainly seems to rank lower in importance than topics like so-called cancel culture, the existential threat of critical race theory and the 1619 Project, making transgender teenagers' lives harder, and making it more difficult for marginalized minorities to vote. From where I'm sitting, it is these issues, rather than economic concerns of any nature, that appear to occupy the minds of both GOP's elite and its rank and file. One possibility is that such concerns have been stratified by socioeconomic status, which, if true, would add an interesting wrinkle to this discussion. Now, let me say a few things about the issue of the notion of issue control. So it's long been observed, that the right wing in this country has been able to exercise far more message discipline than has the left traditionally. This is due in part to the hierarchical nature of the right-wing media ecosystem, which has evolved for the express purpose of hammering home a small number of simple, elite-friendly messages at any given time. When I look at what Hannity and Trump and Breitbart and the rest of them have been saying lately, I see the same few messages again and again, which are Trump really won, the left is trying to cancel America, and straight white Americans are under threat by minorities and immigrants. So you've got that, and you also got the Lincoln Project and David Brooks and a few others, which if you look at the poll numbers, not many Republicans seem to be paying too much attention to. So instead of a loss of control of the message, I see a quite high degree of control consolidating around anti-democratic electoral reforms and cultural flashpoints. The most unusual aspect of it, to me at least, is that very little of it seems to be directed at the current president personally. To my eyes, there seems to be much less vitriol personally aimed at Biden than there was at Obama. But this vitriol seems to be directed at the most vulnerable in our society. And so the key empirical questions in my mind have to do with the extent to which such a core organizing principle is supported by the evidence. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. We still need to do more systematic research on this. And the key choice in mainstream American politics the key choice the mainstream American right has settled on since the 2020 election appears to be to embrace big lie politics at the expense of facts and democracy. Now, I suspect this is all much more complicated than I've laid it out here, but I'm very curious about the extent to which my characterization resonates with my fellow panelists and the audience. And I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Deen. So next we hear from Camille.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Deen, for these intro comments to our panel. I'm really grateful to be here, and I was thinking through, having investigated and analyzed those different types of groups, those different digital surrogates over the year, like what are a few trends that perhaps I can help bring into focus. And so I came up with three main things. Hopefully they can be helpful. And the first one is that evidently those digital surrogates that we're talking about, I think QAnon, the Proud Boys, the Boogaloo Boys, as Stephen laid out, are very, very adept at navigating the online digital environment. And prior to getting a bit deeper here, I also want to acknowledge how different these groups are from one another, which also means that they live on a different spectrum, from more helpful to less useful to conservative politics, traditional conservative politics. And I think here the best example of that is the Boogaloo Boys, which of course is an ideology that's rooted in libertarianism that is at times very aligned with conservative politics, for instance, around their advocacy for the Second Amendment online, and at times completely at odds with it, having, for instance, carried sometimes a very strong pro-BLM agenda in their online gatherings. And so these types of groups, again, acknowledging that they're very different from one another, do understand the dynamics of what types of formats go viral on social media, and they understand the nuances of algorithmic amplification and sort of the cat and mouse game that they have to play with platforms to get their content out there. And that, I think, is really the primary way that they're overall shaping the public dialogue and the conservative conversation. Trump is very clearly here acting as a figure for them to start identifying with party politics in a way that wasn't evident a few years ago, and that became very clear about a year and a half ago. And so when you look at it from a network analysis perspective, what you see is online clusters of accounts who are representative of these online movements, who were initially sort of objects that were distinct but close. For instance, the Trump supporters on some network maps and the QAnon supporters, that over the last year and a half have really fused to sort of become one big cluster of aligned political identity. And so that's, I think, really a development that was important for people who study these movements in terms of network science, and really showed that indeed there was a fusion of identity. Now, the other thing that became clear from a network science observation is the influence of these groups on the online political conversation isn't always manifest to those who are receiving it. And, we've talked a lot about, for instance, people coming to rallies with QAnon shirts, and that's very visible and interesting. But there's also a much more subtle and definitely more difficult to measure way in which the themes and narratives that originate with these groups really land in the mainstream. And I would say the conversation in which we've seen this more than ever is around the pandemic and the COVID-19 disinformation. And again, if you take sort of a systematic network approach to this, what we had done was to map the impact of QAnon on the mainstream COVID-19 conversation over the month. And over the last year and a half, the QAnon online networks have really become more and more central and prominent in shaping how conservatives and how, honestly, the general public have been talking about COVID-19. That dynamic was also manifest in the Stop the Steal movement, which is a really interesting fusing of, on one end, what I would call original sort of old tactics of party politics operators, and online movement here that really come and serve as those digital surrogates. I'm going to take a very small detour here to talk about why I think this is also the reason why we see foreign actors double down on targeting these digital surrogates. And before I get there, I want to be crystal clear on the fact that none of the foreign actors that we've seen trying to influence the recent election have created or not even significantly amplified those movements, right? They're not the underlying cause for their existence, nor are they the cause for their virality, but they have targeted those digital surrogates in really interesting ways. And in 2020, what we've seen is Russia, for instance, really doubling down on targeting the US far right and using platforms such as Gab and Parler in order to do so, and really sort of inserting itself with creating memes against this sort of like very specific faction that they had not targeted to that extent in 2016. Interestingly, Iran also followed the strategy of doubling down and here really impersonating fringe far-right groups on fringe platforms, in that specific case, impersonating the Proud Boys. And I think here, this is also sort of another way in which this manifest of them understanding the impact that those groups have on shaping the broader conservative conversation. So last thing I want to close on is how those manifest at the international level. Those movements that we were talking about, or at least, conspiratorial movements like QAnon or the organized online far right, do tend to internationalize quickly and much more quickly than traditional conservative politics. And the impact that this has is they are able to import themes and narratives. And so we have seen very clearly a new alignment of, for instance, the populist right in Germany, in France, or in Brazil, with, for instance, this weekend again, clear alt-right bridges who are importing themes, for instance, bringing in Brazil demonstration on electronic voting machines, which were based on Dominion conspiracy theories, which originated and had initially been pushed by American alt-right clusters. So just a few sort of, again, notes of framing from how this looks like from the perspective of how communities form and evolve online, in the hope that this can help inform our conversation today.
Thank you, Camille. Next one up is Kurt Knüpfer from Berlin. And I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions and comments, please leave them in the chat. We'll take them from there. Welcome, Kurt.
So yeah, hi everyone. Great to be with you from Berlin. Thanks to SSRC and everyone who's involved in setting this up and inviting me to speak. I'm hugely honored, of course. And I'll try to do my best to add something to the conversation that hasn't already been said. So I think from what the previous speakers have said and added to Daniel Ziblatt's thoughts is that institutions and organizations are maybe no longer the way to look at what we're seeing, right? So we just heard about networks forming online and kind of becoming entangled with one another. So we're dealing very much with moving targets these days. And in fact, I really appreciated Dean Frielen's comments about the Republican Party and whether that's still a center-right party. I think the same is true for Germany if we consider who is really here the center of kind of conservative politics. We're very much moving away from the CDU, as was mentioned, and moving towards the AfD when locating some of these developments that were talked about, I think. So we're dealing with novel actor types, and I think that means that we do well to really focus on communicative dynamics, along with the practices and logics that they unfold, rather than set lists of actor types. So I'd like to use my 10 minutes to briefly propose two sets of dynamics that I think have already been alluded to as well, that I'm basically going to subsume under affect and narratives. And I'll explain how both of these form particular constellations between the center and periphery of right-wing contemporary politics, in my view. And of course, then I'll always consider briefly the impact of the digital on both of these. What is the productive force of what we're seeing in terms of digitality? So the first communicative dynamic between parties and peripheries that I want to highlight is affect. For conservative parties or right-wing elites, I think mobilizing new communities and expanding peripheral networks who are engaged in this, affect can really provide a readily available entry point. So here the goal is to ultimately seek out an affective community that might emerge around a particular issue. And we heard about these cross-cutting issues previously. So affect really enables them to harness these groups' capacities to generate political mobilization. And the goal essentially is to transform an affective community into a potential surrogate. So what does the digital do here? The connective communication environment, I would argue, does essentially two things. First of all, it makes it easier for such affective communities to form in the first place, to find each other, to talk to one another, and to form connective ties. But secondly, it also makes them more visible to political actors. And we've also heard that in previous comments. So these actors, the center of conservative or right-wing politics, might seek to selectively engage or listen to these affective communities, listening kind of a term that I'm borrowing from Dave Karp's work here. So what are the pitfalls here, right? And what basically illustrates the contemporary version of the conservative dilemma from this perspective? So I would argue that specific forms of affect appear to dominate in digital environments, where the potential for inclusivity does not equal actual pluralism, but instead might be a footprint of a high concentration of specific actors. And this might ultimately lead to a false sense of import for specific political issues. Even worse, catering to these communities might alienate other actors within your potential peripheral network if you are a right-wing party. And these actors, these peripheral communities might be less visible and simply not as loud. So to name an example, we actually looked at the AfD, right? So the far right German party that's moved continuously farther to the right and the radical right in recent years. So together with actually Ulrike and Lance Bennett and others, we looked at how this party picked up a campaign selectively that was spawned by the extremist identitarian movement and was then subsequently amplified via a fairly small number of extremely active super spreaders, as we call them in our research. So this campaign looked incredibly loud and important for a short amount of time, even within our data sets. But ultimately, this issue just fizzled out and basically led nowhere for the party. So the second communicative dynamic that I wanted to highlight is our narratives. So for political parties, right-wing political parties and their potential surrogates, a shared master narrative basically fulfills the role of providing a collectively shared heuristic, if we were. These in turn can be applied to interpret and explain newly emergent events and occurrences. They basically provide an interpretive framework that is repeated again and again and again in different contexts and in reaction to different political occurrences. So I think we heard some examples for such master narratives, but I would also argue that on the political right, there are fairly few of them, right, if you go far enough up. So one being, of course, that there's a liberal hegemony in the media and the mainstream. We heard about that. And the other one, especially also in Europe, is that conservatives or kind of the ethnic majority of a given nation state are actually under threat of being replaced and under siege. So the simpler or perhaps also more Manichaean these narratives become, the more potential they also have to activate heuristics in reaction to novel events. So the mentioned kind of examples of cancel culture or kind of also the iterations repeated again and again of political correctness, they essentially also point towards such heuristics, I would argue. So this is enticing, of course, for political parties and actors. Simple us versus them narratives instantly create a periphery and a political opponent around one's own position. And it makes it easy to advocate against progressive reform programs or state intervention aimed at social equity, etc., on the grounds that this is something that is pushed by this perceived other side. What does the digital do here? First and foremost, it has essentially broadened the diversity and also the reach of right-wing communities and media formats across many democratic systems, probably all of them. The increasingly vast ecosystems collectively cultivate master narratives by a constant activation of the underlying heuristics that interpret and reduce the world's complexity. Meanwhile, potential voters aren't just observers in these processes, but often actively are invited to participate along these with these processes. So we heard about the AfD being active on YouTube and other social media channels. Again, there are pitfalls that might illustrate the contemporary form of the current conservative dilemma, though. So I would argue that by inviting in these disparate communities and actors into maybe the tent of these master narratives, right-wing parties are also reducing the spectrum of their own ability to advocate for a specific policy response by selectively defining particular problems. So by tapping into these narratives, they're not just cultivating a sense of in-group belonging, they're also now monitored and immediately impacted by a much wider variety of surrogates who base their evaluation of a given political stance on the basis of its purity vis-a-vis a unifying master narrative. So you can quickly, if you fall into this trap, you can quickly become a part of the perceived other side, right? Mitt Romney, etc., might come to mind, as was mentioned. So in summarizing this, I would argue that digital networks broaden the periphery, but actually reduce the discursive leeway available to political elites over time if they seek to harness this unifying power. So examples for this, if there's time for these, I think one that stands out that we've been working on, I've been working on with Babak Bahadur, also from GW, is the early framing of Trump's COVID response, where he really floundered to kind of find a way in which to talk about this, right? Because it didn't jive with the dominant master narrative of, there's nothing going on and this is a hoax, etc. Another example from Germany is, again, the AfD, who was pretty successful in campaigning against migration policies. But as they tried to pivot to other policy fields where they are actually required to make active proposals or even form coalitions with the perceived other side, they are under massive duress here and increasingly radicalized by kind of the ideological purity of their own constituents. To summarize my points, since digital connections between parties and peripheries are so tenuous and fleeting, and since classic definitions of institutions might no longer hold, I think we do well to look at other concepts as the key to understanding the relationship between surrogates and political parties. And affect and narratives might be two examples of such focal points for a more communication-based approach to investigating the current form of the conservative dilemma. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kurt Knüpfer, Camille, Francois, Deen, Frielen, also for your amazing time management. So we still have enough time to discuss. I would like to ask the whole panel to perhaps turn on their cameras now so we can see each other when we kick off this discussion. But before we do that, and I've seen there are some questions already in the chat, I would play the ball back to Daniel Ziblatt to perhaps react and comment on your remarks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very, very interesting. I took lots of notes, I have to say. One response, and then actually your presentations all provoked more questions from me, so I'm going to then throw them back to you guys. So the first point is just in response to Dean's comments. I mean, I fully agree, and actually, I mean, your intuition about the Republican Party no longer being a party of the center-right is absolutely correct. And there's some recent research done by the Varieties of Democracy group, which is based in Sweden, which has done through these expert surveys, cross-nationally ranking political parties' ideologies, stances towards democracy over time. And you can really track, annual scores. The American Republican Party used to kind of be in the same realm as the German Christian Democratic Party, the British Tory Party, but over the last 15 years has completely veered off course and is now actually to the right of many radical right parties in Western Europe. I mean, very similar stances on immigration and so on, it was the far right, but actually much more explicitly anti-democratic than parties of the far right in Western Europe. Are often illiberal, anti-immigrant, and in many ways very reactionary, but not so explicitly anti-democratic in the sense of not accepting election results and so on. And so the American Republican Party, I would agree with you entirely, is no longer, for the most part, a center-right party. And that's really the puzzle in a way, is to explain this. I mean, there's really very few instances in the history of democracy of parties going bad in this way. And because normally the idea is that if you go off course, voters will punish parties that go to the extremes. You lose and you get punished, and you kind of regroup, you come up with a new program, new leaders, and you come back. And what was so striking, I think, about the 2020 election results was the degree to which the defeat was not interpreted as a defeat, but as interpreted as a great success. And there were these incredible stories, in the New York Times and the Washington Post right after the election, where there were these gatherings, the Republican Party and the head of the Republican Party saying, the election was a great success. And so the loss was interpreted as a victory in some way. So that, I think, trying to understand that is one of the great puzzles. And I do think that the domain that we're talking about provides part of the explanation, that there is, and I think Kurt's account of, in a way, this idea that there's a kind of diminishing, that the emergence of these kind of narratives provided an opportunity for parties to kind of tap into some kind of base, but on the other hand, kind of entrap the party because it no longer can violate the kind of rhetoric in these narratives, and so this kind of helps push these parties further to the right, even if voters are not necessarily there. And I think we see this in the U.S. Today. So I agree with that. Two questions I guess I had, and this kind of ties together, I think, Deen and Camille's presentations. So Camille, I was particularly struck by your description of the idea that there are these kind of networks, and I'm sort of trying to imagine visually what this looks like, and that over time they kind of fuse and get attached to party, or have a kind of more political side to it. So I'm wondering, what does that look like? Could you describe to us what that actually looks like? What are the data that you see? Is there some visual way of conceptualizing this and the timing of when this happened? So that's one question. And then a second question, coming back to Deen's comments, he noted that the right-wing media ecosystem is much more hierarchical than, I presume you mean, than center-left or mainstream media ecosystem. And I'm wondering, how does one know that? What does the kind of data look like? Has that changed over time? And so it's sort of analogous, I guess, to Camille's point about the kind of network structures of these. And I just would love to hear more about that. So I think I'll stop there. But really, thank you for the great comments, all three of you, and I learned a lot.
Okay, so very briefly, Camille and Deen, you want to answer that? And we already have lots of questions in the chat. So if you can keep it brief, that would be great.
Deen, you want me to start? Okay. Okay, so stick with me. This is going to be difficult without a graph, but essentially what we do in network mapping is we identify communities of users who have high interconnectivity, and so they pay a lot of attention to one another. And so when you have a very connected community, it looks like a hairball, right? To your question of what does it actually look like? It looks like a very tight hairball. And when you have a lot of connection in between those accounts, you tend to have a lot of coordination between real people who follow one another very closely and therefore can quickly dominate online conversation. Now, it used to be that we had a QAnon hairball, which is a very clear community in network structure sense of people who are very tightly interwoven and connected to one another. And then another hairball, distinct, which was the Trump supporters hairball. They defined one another differently. The QAnon accounts would say, I am a QAnon account, and then the Trump supporters would define themselves in relationship with their Trump support. And what we saw was a dual movement of both of these communities actually fusing together, which meant that they now followed one another as much as they followed each other within those clusters, right? So it's like a fusing of density, and those two communities become one. And as a result, we also saw the way they self-define online change, with the QAnon accounts starting to self-define as Trump patriots. And so those are the two movements that I tried to describe, which again, thank you for listening to this. This is of course easier to visualize, but thank you.
A couple quick comments and responses in terms of answering the question of how we figure out or how we can empirically determine the hierarchical nature of various media networks, whether we're talking about the far right, the center left, or the far left. So one way to do that is to look at the same types of network sociograms that Camille is talking about. And so you can look at things like hyperlinks, the density of connections between different operators in social media, not only the outlets themselves, but also their audiences, the extent to which they disproportionately draw information from a very small network of audiences that is ideologically isolated. And you also can note the distance between ideologically dissimilar outlets. And so a measure of distance there would give you something like an echo chamber look. And so the separation is one aspect. The other aspect has to do with the hierarchical nature. And so you can look at that in terms of the audiences of the different organizations. Some of them are very small, some of them are larger. And also you can look at sort of the limited nature of the issue agenda, right? So in other words, you have a very large agenda, very disparate and diverse agenda. That's one thing. And comparatively, you tend to see that on the center left and the farther left, whereas you have very concentrated and very small issue agendas. And, from the smallest actors on through the largest ones, you tend to see a narrowing in many cases of the issue agenda as you determine what gets to the big daddy of them all, which of course is Fox News, and the larger ones. And so the narrowness, I think, of the issue agenda is something that one can look at empirically to assess, and also the sort of ladder up which these items end up moving. So I have some colleagues that call it trading up the chain, right? So something starts at a very, very small, actor, and then sort of moves up, and then finally is able to make it onto something like Fox News. So looking at a dynamic like that can help you understand the hierarchical nature of sort of an ideologically separated media ecosystem there.
Ulrike, can I just ask one very quick follow-up, if I may? So to Camille, so the first question I had is when did that transformation in QAnon and Trump, so when did that merger happen exactly? And then my other question, just very quickly, I meant to ask her this, which is, does he find similar kinds of hierarchical structures in the German context on the right versus the left? If this kind of dynamic that Deen just described, does that also work in Germany or anywhere else? Thank you.
Yes, Camille, please, it's your turn.
Okay. It's a transformation that was slow and progressive, and I think it became clear structurally over the past 6 months as we got closer to the election. It accelerated. To someone's good point in the chat, this was observed through the larger clusters, which in this case means on Twitter, which of course means this was observed prior to most of the action taken by social media platforms, both against the QAnon supporters and the Trump supporters. There was already places where those communities overlapped. That's very true. But again, at a large scale structural perspective, they remained distinct community, I would say, a year and a half ago, and we really saw them progressively merge. So this is pre-election, and the acceleration was, I would say, about a few months before the election.
Yeah, as to the question of whether we're seeing something similar in Germany, I think what we're seeing is, yes, there is a tightly kind of knit counter public that is emerging that looks very, very similar to what Freelon just described in terms of the US media environment. But secondly, I think we want to be careful with falling into the trap of kind of the same master narrative that I was talking about, right? And saying that they are opposed to something that we would refer to as the left, right? So in the German sense, this would be kind of the set of institutions that you also mentioned, the public broadcasters, right? Or newspapers that are very much still engaged in the project of objectivity and both sides, etc., and pluralism. Some of which tilt maybe to the progressive left, but we want to, I think, be careful to kind of frame this in kind of the American sense of kind of polarized opposites, where we are seeing, and that's the problem here, we are seeing really this emergence of a right-wing counterpublic, specifically centered around core issues of the AfD, and we can observe that empirically, and we are, so.
We have a pretty big question from the audience. This is about the conservative dilemma. So, of course, we're looking very much to the right and far right side of the political spectrum. But what about the left? So the question is, why have extreme right outsiders been seemingly more successful at bypassing media, party, and interest group establishment organizations than the left in recent years? We've heard the right, the far right is really dominating on social media, but isn't that the same opportunity structure for everyone? Who wants to take the question? It's a very big one.
This is a question I do not have. I mean, this is, I think, maybe for the others to answer. I mean, this is the reason I talk about the conservative element. I just am interested in this, and historically, this has proved to be a problem. Why the right's more organized online? I don't know. That's a great question.
Yeah. So perhaps to the scholars looking empirically at social media, why is the left not dominating? Are they just not doing it as well as the right?
So this is actually the topic of a research project that I'm actually starting. And so I think there are a number of answers to this. One of them is historical. So Professor Ziblatt mentioned, Father Coughlin, which means that the right-wing media ecosystem is in the United States, at least, is nearly 100 years old, right? So in other words, this is a very long tradition on the right, and they've had a very long time to be able to build up these kinds of capabilities, these sort of alternative information networks that are able to distribute information in ways that aren't necessarily tempered by the journalistic inclinations of the kinds of outlets that the left primarily gets its information from. So there's a historical piece of this. Another piece, I think, is that some of what the left is doing, and particularly the extreme left in the United States, I have a strong suspicion that the empirical methods that we've been using to study this are inadequate to detect what is actually going on. So I'll give you an example of this. This is nothing I have any empirical evidence of. I'm going to, so like watch this space, I'm actually looking into this. So there's a very popular method of ideological scaling that looks at, so the assumption is you're on Twitter and like follows like. So if you're on the left, you follow mostly left-wing people. If you're on the right, you follow mostly right-wing people. And so I think that such a metric works fairly well for the right, which has a right-wing media ecosystem, right? So you have this media ecosystem that a lot of people are following. It's pretty, makes a lot of sense to be able to infer some degree of ideology from that. Without that, I think that there could be some asymmetric efficacy that's going on here. I need to look into this, but it may very well be the case that this technique doesn't work as effectively for the right as it does for the left. I'm actually going to be testing this. And so we'll be able to do, and so one of the intuitions of this came to me because I started seeing all these accounts just informally, people who are identifying as, anarchists, socialists, communists, obvious buzzwords for the far left, but that were not showing up, in some of these analyses, were showing up in very small numbers. And so I think it's very, very important to understand whether these methods that we're using are actually up to the task of being able to determine and to be able to find what's actually going on with these folks. And so watch this space. I'll be looking into that in the months to come.
Kurt, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just briefly adding on to that, I would also expect that right-wing politics is very loud, right? It's very visible in the digital space. Also because it's so consistent, right? It draws on these single narratives and is geared towards specific issues. That doesn't mean that it's highly effective politically. So I think if you were to measure kind of the impact of left-wing politics, right, that has actually been much more successful in recent years, one might argue, arguably, right? So this is a panel, so people can discuss with me, I guess. But if you look at movements that have advocated for actual reform, actual policies effectively, they tend to come from what we would refer to as the left, right? But they're not integrated into parties as much, and they're not as kind of monolithical, and therefore they're not as loud and as visible.
A really interesting case from recent German politics is also this movement that is opposing coronavirus regulation and is really drawing from left voters, far right voters. It's esoteric people. It's people from the Greens, from the left, from the far right. Coming together with topics of conspiracy theories and whatnot about the coronavirus. So sometimes perhaps just thinking across political or party politics as limiting our view here, possibly. We have another question that's moving us to the Rust Belt and centers on swing voters and the Obama-Trump voter. So the question is from Clifford Bob, and he's asking that, or he's pointing that a good portion of Trump voters, especially in the Rust Belt, were previously Democratic Party voters who left in part because they seem to have believed that Democrats had forsaken them for economic elites. Now, how does Professor Ziblatt focus on the conservative dilemma, understand the Obama-Trump voter, and more generally the long-term move by such voters away from the center-left, as well perhaps as from the center-right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the questioner identifies a real phenomenon, and that is people who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump. It's hard to know why they did this, though. Of course, part of the explanation probably is something that the questioner asks about, resentment of economic elites. But I think part of it is also driven by resentment, a kind of sense of a culture under siege, and although people voted for Obama, that there was a sense that things had gone too far, and there's a kind of reaction against that, and turn to vote for Trump, or a kind of sense that you support some kind of outsider. So I think one of the ways that Republicans have dealt with this is exactly to not talk about only economic issues, but to also talk about cultural issues and to tap in all sorts of resentments. And so I think this is a kind of perfect instance of this. I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear is if you look at voting data over, a 50-year period, the gap between the richest Republican voter and, let's say, the 90th percentile Republican voter and the 50th percentile Republican voter in terms of income has grown. So back in the 1950s, the difference between the richest Republican voter and the median Republican voter wasn't that great, but that gap has grown over time. And so now, and part of that is driven by the increasing wealth of those at the highest level of income strata, but also part of it is that the Republican coalition has become more diverse socioeconomically. Although culturally, in terms of race, it's not. I mean, still 90% white voting base. And so, I mean, essentially, and so in order for the Republican Party to survive, it has to appeal to people along other lines. And so Deen had made the point earlier that, maybe Republican voters don't care that much about inequality. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the entire agenda of the Republican Party is to talk about other issues and to sort of change the topic of conversation. And so I think that's a lot of what's happened with the Republican Party, and and one sees kind of different dynamics in different countries. But I think part of the kind of degree to which, like the CDU, let's say in Germany, has not in recent years run on cultural issues, partly reflects lower levels of economic inequality. So I think the high levels of economic inequality, even if people aren't talking about it, may still be driving the strategies of the Republican Party.
We have a counterfactual from Lance Bennett. His question is basically that since the 1980s, the Republican Party in the US had already developed a plan to solve the conservative dilemma, a combination of voter suppression and appointing judges to uphold those measures. So the counterfactual is, if Trump had not won and the radical right media ecosystem had not become so oriented towards to extremism, what predictions would you make about the path of US democracy under the original Republican strategy?
Yeah, well, I think there's three general possible solutions to the conservative dilemma for conservatives. Number one is to do what the questioner asks, which is to repress the vote, to simply make it so that these people who are not going to vote for you can't vote. And in some ways, I think we see some of that going on anyway right now. Another is to try to change the topic of conversation and turn the kind of topic of conversation and political debate onto terms that are more favorable to you. And then the third option, which is the least kind of the option that happens least often, is that conservatives could in fact reach out and have a more inclusive base. And I think there were in the early in the post Bush era, there was all three of these strands were around. I mean, there was this autopsy report that the Republican Party produced after the Romney defeat, in which there were some members of the Republican Party establishment who said we need to reach out to female voters, non-white voters, if we want to succeed. This obviously was not followed. This strategy was not followed. One could argue whether it could have ever been followed, but that's a potential counterfactual. And I think had Trump not won in 2016, that strand may have had more leverage within the Republican Party. But I think nothing succeeds like success, and because Trump had won, I think many Republicans who clearly were opposed to him in the primaries rallied around him because they thought this was the winning strategy. So I think what's pretty clear is that since the Republican strategy failed in 2020, the response now is to go back to that counterfactual that the questioner asked, which is to repress the vote. And that's what's happening across U.S. states right now, is massive efforts to disenfranchise the vote, to generate a more friendly electorate for the Republican Party without forcing the Republican Party itself to change its agenda and its main social base.
I have a question for Camille. Next, could Camille talk a bit more about the activity of Russian accounts passing as Western right-wing extremists in alternative platforms like Gab and Parler in 2020-21? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I investigated this and exposed it alongside a few colleagues. We wrote a report called Step Into My Parlor, because we have a terrible sense of humor. And I will give you the top lines of what we saw happen. In 2020, Russian actors created a fake newsroom, which was called NAABC. They hired unwitting freelancers and asked them to write far-right pieces targeting far-right audiences. They pretended the newsroom was based in Hungary, which goes to the point we were discussing about this also being a little bit of an international phenomenon. And in order to recruit people to their content, they created fake accounts on a number of platforms, including far-right platforms such as Gab and Parler. There's a lot that's really interesting to unpack here, and I think that might be a distraction from the core questions we're discussing. So I'll just say that something that was difficult is, while most of the mainstream social media platforms now agree that when this happens, they will take the accounts down, it was not the policy that Gab and Parler observed. And while the Russian accounts continued to pose as far-right US and Hungarian voices, notably to delegitimize the election, to share very racist and inflammatory content, both Gab and Parler decided to keep the fake accounts up. So that's the accelerated version of a complicated story.
Okay, thank you, Camille. The next question is perhaps for Deen or for Kurt, because it's about specifically a perspective or the focus on the media and communication. So Victoria Gao asks, in such a fragmented media area where people are much living in their own bubble or alternative facts world, how could different media platforms try to reach a broader audience?
Well, I think one answer to that is that media outlets are very densely networked, and so typically the way that a smaller outlet will receive exposure to larger ones is to be referenced by one of the larger ones. And so one way, for example, this happens in the right-wing media ecosystem is that they'll try to insert themselves into the agenda of the larger outlets. So in other words, every time a Breitbart or a Gateway pundit is cited on Fox News or on I guess to a lesser extent Newsmax or an OAN, that's going to send some folks their way. And the same thing happens. So that's as true as it is on television as on the internet. So if that's a media outlet mentioning somebody in an online story or retweeting content or sharing content on social media, that's going to push eyeballs back to the original smaller outlet. So I think that's one of the ways that some of these smaller outlets will get larger audiences. But there are bounds around that in many cases, increasingly, it seems this is the case, there are bounds around that are ideological in nature. So there are certain boundaries that Fox News will find it very, very difficult to cross. And increasingly, that's true also of more mainstream outlets like the New York Times and USA Today and the rest of them. So there's a lot going on there. I think that's one piece of the puzzle.
Kurt or Camille? Professor Ziblatt, do you want to add to that?
So yeah, maybe just a brief observation from one of our projects that also goes to some of these questions on transnationality. We actually looked at right-wing alternative news sites in different countries across 6 different democracies, and we looked at their hyperlinking practices. And what we found was that they did link to one another within their respective national context. They also linked transnationally, especially the US was a target, right? So for especially Swedish and German sites. So there was a certain power dynamic there. But by far, the most links that we found in all of these sites collectively, also transnationally, were targeted at what we might refer to as mainstream media. So the New York Times was up there, Reuters was up there, BBC was up there, right? So this is also kind of where their focus comes from. This is how they draw in information, and they always see themselves in reaction to the to the mainstream. So we might want to push back a little bit against kind of this notion of a completely isolated echo chamber or complete fragmentation, right? There's also, there's always dialogue going on, and the frames used by the New York Times are just repackaged and altered for partisan purposes on these sites.
Can I just add one thing here? And I think one of the, I mean, in my conversations with Steve Livingston, there's this interesting parallel that I think that Camille described with the way in which these groups that are sort of autonomous get attached to essentially a political phenomena. And as a political scientist, I'm interested in these groups, but I'm also interested when they become attached to a political figure like Donald Trump or a political campaign or a political party. And one of the things that really was clear looking at the historical period that I looked at, the pre-World War I period, pre-World War II period, is that you have these kinds of groups, veterans associations, radical right groups that are kind of their own groups. They're not connected to politicians. But at some point, politicians looking out on the horizon realize these groups could be useful to us. And so they start talking to them. They get them to show up at election events, at election rallies. They try to associate themselves with them. They kind of bolster them up. And at first, this kind of seems like a good deal because you now suddenly have this highly mobilized base that can get people to show up at election time, to talk the way you want them to talk that benefits you. But over time, who's using who changes, or who's taking advantage of who changes. The playing field kind of changes, and eventually the groups start to impose discipline on the politicians. And if you have politicians now departing from the lines that they've seemingly embraced when embracing these groups, they then the politicians themselves have to start to cater to these groups. And it seems to me, so this kind of the phrase that I use to describe this process is organizational capture. The organizations capture the party. At first, the party's trying to capture the organization, but suddenly you realize, it's this famous story of Aesop's fable where the guy gets on the horse and he thinks he thinks the horse is bringing him somewhere, but very soon he realizes he can't get off the horse. The horse is calling the shots. And I think this is a little bit of, this happened historically with non-digital organizations and political parties. And the process that Camille described to me sounds like an analogous process in which these groups get attached to parties. That seems great to the politicians, but at some point this actually starts to push politicians in directions that are, some politicians have to retire because they can't deal with the kind of rhetoric that they're associated with. And the only guys who can survive are those who toe the line of these groups. And so that's sort of an analogous process.
We still have quite a few super interesting and important questions. We could spend lots of more time to discuss this, I'm quite sure. But unfortunately, our time is already up for this panel. Actually, we're a little bit over time already. So all I can say is thank you, Daniel Ziblatt, Camille, Francois, Deen, Frielen, Kurt Knüpfer, for discussing, for sharing your perspectives. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your questions and for your comments. And I'm turning the microphone over to Stephen Livingston to close this session for now. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. What an amazing start to this workshop. I am very grateful for everyone's contributions. I thought the presentation, the keynote address was just spot on and insightful. So thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you to the plenary panel members. It was a great discussion. I'm looking forward to continuing this dialogue, both in this workshop, but also moving forward in our offline conversations, and maybe someday face-to-face yet once again. So thank you. And this concludes today's open part of our work. The workshop will go into a closed session where we will continue this dialogue amongst ourselves and try to come up with some additional answers to the questions that have been provocatively raised in this discussion. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Take care now.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ulrike.